Three, two, one, and we are rocking and rolling. Ladies and gents, welcome back to the Seb Whitehouse show. I am joined today, I'm very happy actually to be joined today by a lady who wrote the book on Christmas. Not the Bible, literally the book of Christmas, which I have to say is honestly, without a shadow of a doubt, the most wholesome book I have ever read in my entire life. It's 270 something pages of pure, fuzzy wholesomeness. And I learnt more about Christmas in the time spent reading this book than all of my life previously. Jane Struthers, welcome to the Seb Whitehouse show, and thanks a lot for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So can you tell me a little bit about yourself, Jane? Who are you? What do you do? And how did you end up writing this really lovely book on Christmas?
Thank you. Well, I'm a writer. I've written over 30 non-fiction books on all kinds of topics. And I'm also an astrologer and a homeopath, but I just love writing, and I'm very fortunate that my life steered me in the direction of writing. And I wrote the book of Christmas because I'd written a previous book called Red Sky at Night, which was about the British countryside and traditions and everything to do with kind of an old-fashioned sort of way of looking at the world, I suppose. But it had a lovely, nostalgic, cozy feel to it. And it did very well. And the publishers said, well, Christmas is the next obvious choice. And I thought that's absolutely wonderful because I love Christmas. And so I had tremendous fun writing this book. And it was the longest Christmas ever because I started it in about November. And even though the Christmas decorations had gone down in January, of course, I was still immersed in Christmas. And it was one of the mildest springs on record. I think at one point it got up to 20 odd in February. And I was still writing about snow and robins. And so it was quite an exercise in imagination trying to get back into the book, but I just loved writing it.
So you say that you love Christmas, and you mentioned that you wrote a book about sort of countryside and tradition. You also mentioned that you're an astrologer. So am I correct in saying that in this increasingly changing time, in this world where for many people, a lot of the traditions that they may have grown up with may be becoming less popular. We also witnessing the decline of organized religion, for example. Are you one of these people, as am I, who really respects tradition, or at least in some respect wants tradition to continue?
Oh, yes. I'm afraid I'm unashamed traditionalist in some ways. Not in others, but in terms of Christmas. I think definitely, because it's something to hold on to, and it's a thread that links generations. And I like looking back on previous Christmases and traditions and continuing them, really, things that we did when we were small. I still like to do them.
Yeah, because Christmas is such a huge part of our lives every year from childhood to adulthood, and it's a focal point on the calendar which everyone looks forward to. And yet I think the number of people who actually know why we do the things we do at Christmas is ridiculously small. I've always loved Christmas as well. And yet, as someone that's always loved Christmas, as someone who at one point when I was in my old flat, I had one year 2 10-foot candy canes, an inflatable snowman in my front room. And I love getting festive. I love that time of year. But, turkey, mistletoe, Santa Claus, Christmas trees. Does anyone actually know why we do any of these things or where they come from?
Well, yes, that's right, because we just take them for granted, don't we?
Yeah.
Candy canes, you imagine that, for instance, that they're American, they are American, and they caught up in, you might think, well, they don't mean anything except just little sugary things to hang on the Christmas tree. But actually, apparently, they are a nod to the shepherds who watched in the fields when baby Jesus was born, and allegedly, and so they are shepherd's crooks. But they've been striped.
Wow. Well, that's one of of many facts I think that we're going to uncover in this conversation, and which I uncovered while reading your book. It seems to me like tradition, ritual, coming together as a family or a community is an integral part of the human experience, something we've placed importance on for centuries. And I suppose for a long time, religion was a vessel for that. And even though religion, for a lot of people anyway, at least in this country, Christianity has declined for so many, it's like we refuse to give up at least some of the religious practices and celebrations that provided that framework of coming together in celebration. Because something I found myself pondering while reading your book is how many non-religious people celebrate Christmas. Because the religious aspect has disappeared for many, and yet the emphasis on Christmas, on that time of year, has remained the same, which is quite interesting, really.
Yes, absolutely. And for some people, it's the only time of year when they go to church. They might go to midnight mass and love the Christmassy feel of it, but wouldn't step near the place for the other 12 months of the year and well, the other 364 days of the year. So yes, it's interesting, isn't it? It's this kind of gut feeling somehow that even if you might think, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in the baby Jesus and all the rest of it, you might think it's all a fairy story. But nevertheless, I will get out my little nativity scene every year, or I will hang a star on top of the Christmas tree. Don't really know, or an angel. Yeah. Yes, it's just part of our DNA almost.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is what you just mentioned, the person who doesn't go to church and isn't remotely religious, but gets out the nativity play or puts the star on the tree. These are often the same people who, if you were to ask them, are you christening your child? They may say, oh, well, I'm not religious. What's the point? Or they might eat a bit of chocolate at Easter, but really they don't celebrate or mark the Easter festival at all. And yet something about Christmas has just hung on and on and on for centuries, or indeed millennia. And that's something that I learned sort of while reading your book, that you write in the book about the midwinter festivals that preceded Christmas. Do you think almost Christmas had a head start, if you will? The midwinter festivals were so ingrained perhaps already in our DNA that by the time Christmas was created or pushed by the church, that the midwinter festivals had so much momentum behind them that we're still feeling that momentum millennia later.
Completely agree. My take on it is that, yes, we had all these so-called pagan festivals, midwinter festivals, where you celebrated the winter solstice, the time of year when the sun had reached as far south as it could go, and then it stayed apparently stationary for 4 days, and then it started to move back up again towards the north. And so this was a really important time for our ancestors thousands of years ago, because it meant crops would start to grow again. You didn't have to light precious candles for quite so long every day. I imagine what it must have been like thousands of years ago. The number of things we take for granted, these little fairy lights on my mantelpiece back there. Can you imagine? Nothing. It's pitch black for hours and hours every day. So it was a very important time of the year, a dreadful, dreary time of the year. So no wonder everybody wanted to have a festival and to enjoy themselves. And I think the Romans had a festival called Saturnalia, where they celebrated the god Saturn. And they would untie Saturn's statue, would have little woolen bandages on it. And at Saturnalia, around about it started off the 17th of December and extended a bit after that. And they would untie these little bandages around Saturn, the feet of Saturn's statue, so that Saturn could join in. And Saturn was the god of agriculture. So it was very important to honor Saturn. And then it became a longer period, Saturnalia, where it was about 4 or 5 days of complete revelry and great fun. And I imagine that when the Christian church got going, that in around the 300s, it thought that the founding fathers really thought, well, how can we impose this completely new idea on everybody without a complete revolt. We'll have to bolt on all the old traditions and give them a Christian spin. So that's what they did, I think. And so, I mean, for instance, this Sol, who was the sun god, he was celebrated for about 50 years, and his picture was on Roman coins. And then suddenly it vanished at the time when Christianity was coming into the Roman Empire. And by the 4th century, it was Christmas. That's what you celebrated on the 25th of December. And so Christmas had completely obliterated, or tried to obliterate, everything that went before. But many of our traditions actually go far back, much further than Christianity. Christmas trees, for instance.
When did we? So just to clarify, would you say this is correct? That is Saturnalia the first recorded example of a midwinter festival that eventually took the shape of Christmas?
The Danes celebrated something interestingly called Yule. And so there may well have been, I imagine every culture really in the Western Hemisphere celebrated in some way at the deepest, darkest point of December.
Yeah, because that's fascinating, because Saturnalia, I believe from the information in your book, the first recorded sort of examples of the festival Saturnalia was sort of in the maybe 100 years before Jesus was born, around then. And obviously there's limitations to how much writing was taking place anyway, so we can't actually know. But this midwinter festival, it could conceivably, the midwinter festivals that we now call Christmas, could conceivably have gone back 10,000 years.
Oh, easily.
Or more.
Or more, I should think. Yeah. Yeah. It's a kind of atavistic thing, I think. It's something really ingrained in us to celebrate the end of the long nights and just the beginning of longer days. And with everything that comes with it, especially in old agrarian cultures in the past, where it was so important to honour nature because it was what you completely relied on, which of course we still do. We just think we don't.
Yeah, and you mentioned just then about just taking a moment, which I would like to just sort of re-articulate, just taking a moment, because this is something that really struck me while reading your book. I even mentioned it to my mum when I was watching TV with her at her house last night. Like, to truly try and imagine that period of time where it was dark for sort of, I guess, 16 hours a day, and there was obviously no electricity, and we were getting all of our light and our heat from fires. And it's just mind-blowing to just pause and think about for a minute. And I think that's something that I think is truly special, to continue celebrating Christmas almost for that reason, to be continuing a festival, even though the times that they were living in was so harsh and the times that we're living in are so comfortable. We're still taking part in that a kind of unbroken lineage of celebration. It's incredible.
Yes, yeah, I agree. Yeah.
The Roman festival of Saturnalia. So there was the did you say the Danes celebrated Yule and the Romans celebrated Saturnalia? So we think these are the earliest recorded sort of Christmas festivals, because Saturnalia, it made me laugh when I was reading your book. You said there'd be a public banquet, feasting, drinking, everywhere would close, and even gifts were exchanged. And I was reading it and I was thinking, okay, so this was pre-Christianity, but this sounds a hell of a lot like Christmas. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly, yeah. Yes, do they know it's Christmas? No, they don't.
So also, so Saturnalia, you mentioned, was the festival of the sun god. And now within Christianity, Christmas is the celebration of the Son of God. Is that just a linguistic coincidence?
I've often wondered that. Actually, Saturn was not the sun god. It was Sol who came after, because there was a little festival in between Saturnalia and Christmas called, if my Latin I'm not very good at Latin. It's Dies Natalis Invictus Sol. I think that's the way. The birthday of the unconquered sun. So that tells you that it's the winter solstice. The sun has not disappeared forever. It's coming back. Just as people during solar eclipses always feared that the sun, wiped out of the sky if the eclipse was overhead, and it might not come back again. It always does. But so there was so then they celebrated the sun god, and then yes, Christmas came along. But yes, I'm absolutely positive that it was just the Christian fathers thought, we have got to get these people on side and persuade them to become Christians for all sorts of reasons. And the best way to do that is just to seamlessly flow what they used to enjoy into these new traditions. And we will come up with all kinds of inventive reasons for why Christianity is now the new way of enjoying yourself. I mean, for instance, isn't it extraordinary that the 25th of December is now Christmas Day? As you said, the sun god, and then the Son of God. Well, it works perfectly in our language, in the English language. It doesn't work in other languages, of course. But yes, I've always thought that. Isn't it fascinating?
So the Christian Church conveniently decided that the 25th of December was going to be Jesus's birthday. They performed a bit of tactical finesse by capitalizing on an already popular midwinter festival and then linking it to Christianity to make Christianity more appealing. But the cool thing about that is that means that a couple of thousand years later, or maybe 1700 years later, it still makes complete sense for non-religious people to celebrate Christmas, regardless of whether or not they're Christians, because the midwinter festivals that were pretty similar to Christmas were being celebrated for probably thousands of years before that.
Oh,
so,
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, in other cultures, other religions also have big celebrations at this time of year where they welcome, they celebrate light. Hanukkah, for instance, Diwali. They're all about festivals of light.
It's funny, I had a festive feast last week with a few of my friends. A friend of mine is a chef, and he's a very good chef. And I don't eat like this very often, and I actually haven't had a festive feast quite this decadent ever. But we had 3 courses. We had partridge for the first course, mallard for the second course, and then a venison Wellington.
Wow.
I know. I don't know who I think I am. The audacity of it. But really, while reading your book, I got a real sense of taking part in something that's been being taken part in for so long, and there's something so wholesome and satisfying about that, knowing that these midwinter feasts have been going on so long, and you're not just, well, I mean, the food is nice as well. You are just stuffing your face, but you're not just stuffing your face. You're doing something that, wouldn't it be great if we could look 10,000 years into the future now and see that humans were still celebrating a festival, if not identical to, but quite similar to Christmas? It kind of links us all together, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Yes. Yeah.
So when you were growing up, was Christmas a big occasion for you? Is it still a big occasion now?
Oh, yeah. It's still a big thing for me. And when I was small, it was so exciting. And we had our own traditions, and I just loved the magical feeling of it. I loved it. And the moment we had Halloween, I knew that this was the magical part of the year, because Halloween, then you've got bonfire night, and then suddenly it's the first. Well, actually, not suddenly. It seems to take forever, but then it's the 1st of December at last. First window of the Advent calendar open, and it was wonderful. And yeah, and my family celebrated Christmas in a nice way. It was a very traditional, cozy Christmas always.
That's nice.
Yeah.
You've used the word cozy a couple of times. I'm also someone that likes coziness. It's just so nice, isn't it? When it's all warm inside and you've got the lights on the tree and it's dark and you're watching movies. It's just, I generally say that I don't actually like this time of year. Not because of Christmas, obviously, but just because of the cold and the dark and stuff. But it does have its advantages. And I think being cozy is one of them.
Oh, yes, definitely. Definitely. And if
um,
you have a real fire as well.
oh, yeah. I don't, unfortunately, but maybe one day. Something I loved when reading your book, and this is definitely a Christmas tradition, which I don't think many people know about. I certainly didn't. Is the Lord of Misrule? Can you tell me about the Lord of Misrule?
Well, yes, now he goes back to Saturnalia because the Romans believed that these few little days of the year when everybody was celebrating, the natural order of things was turned on its head. So it's a tradition in Saturnalia that the masters would serve, they would wait on their servants. It was the only time of year when they were able to do that. And so where the Lord of Misrule was the idea that there would be a kind of man in charge of Christmas. I think it was always a man. And particularly in medieval times, he would be appointed earlier in the year. And in fact, he would be chosen on All Hallows Eve, on Halloween, 31st of October. There would be a Lord of Misrule would be chosen for each aristocratic house. That was the kind of echelons where this was practiced. And the Lord of Misrule would preside over all the Christmas hijinks. And as his name implies, things would go topsy-turvy because it was that time of year, they still believed, when everything was turned upside down. So there was still the idea that the gentry would wait on their not their slaves, but their servants and tenant farmers and so on, and just for once. And there were all sorts of goings on, and you can only imagine just how very, very badly people would have behaved, because especially in big houses where the brakes are off, we can do whatever we like, especially as it's Christmas and it is the Lord of Misrule presiding over everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah. Well, I never knew. I never knew about the Lord of Misrule, and you wrote about, and you mentioned then that the slaves would become masters for a short while, and then later on in the church, boys would become bishops for a few days as well. So historically, Christmas was about creating. It wasn't kind of just about celebrating. It was almost about switching the natural order of things and creating some sort of festive chaos. And I find that really interesting to hear about that.
It is fascinating, isn't it?
Hmm.
Yeah. And presumably, in those times when everything was so rigid and you had to know your place, this was some form of brief liberation.
Right. Okay. So that, and in that way, it dovetails with the way that we celebrate it today, because although things aren't as rigid now, we still, of course, we have our working week, we have families to look after, we still have responsibilities. And so I suppose our modern day version of that festive chaos is just kind of eating, drinking, and being merry. But perhaps back then, as you say, things were so much more rigid that they almost needed more chaos.
Yes, I think so, actually. And then it helped, basically, I should imagine it helped to control things. So people who had a tough time of it the rest of the year could look forward to a couple of days every year when things were easier and fun. Yeah, and they could boss their boss around. Must have been great.
Yeah, that's fascinating. What I would give to be a fly on the wall of an old aristocratic house in the sort of 15th century and seeing the Lord of Misrule wandering around the place. I think I would be good at being a Lord of Misrule, you know. That's the impression I got when I was reading the book. I was like, that sounds fun. That sounds like the type of thing I would like to do.
Perhaps it's a tradition you could reinstate.
Do you know what, right? Honestly, you say this, yeah. When I was reading your book, I don't have a family yet, but when I was reading your book, I was just thinking how much of these old traditions I would love to take up when I have children. There's so many of these old traditions have been completely forgotten, such as the Yule Log, for example, which, as you explain in your book, is well. Actually, you know what? Please tell me about the Yule Log, because I would love to have a fireplace big enough to justify having a Yule Log one day, and that's a tradition which I don't think really exists anymore. So could you tell, or at least not to the same extent, could you tell me about the Yule Log?
Yeah, certainly. Well, yeah, for most people now, the Yule log is a chocolate thing that appears on the table at Christmas Day. But originally, it was a huge log. I mean, a tree, basically, which would be chosen ahead of time. It would be chosen in the summer, really, I should imagine, or even in the spring, as the piece of wood that is going to burn in the fireplace from Christmas Eve, hopefully up until the end of the 12 days of Christmas. So that would be a huge, huge tree and a huge fireplace. So I imagine a lot of this was a bit of wishful thinking. But the idea was that it brought good luck. And so the tree would be specially chosen by everybody, although some people were not allowed to choose the tree. If you had a squint, you weren't allowed to go anywhere near that tree because you might bring bad luck. And so the tree would be chosen, it would be felled, they'd have to drag it home. And you'd also have to choose what sort of tree, obviously. You'd need probably something like an ash, which is going to burn pretty green, because imagine you're dragging home this gigantic piece of wood. You can't cut it up because then it won't burn for long enough. And it can't be too sappy when you put it on the fire, otherwise it just won't catch at all. So assuming that it, in best of all possible worlds, you drag home this tree, you put it, takes several people to put it in the fireplace, in gigantic inglenook fireplace. You light it on Christmas Eve, preferably using a piece of charcoal that you've saved from the previous year's Yule log. You light it, and then it's supposed to burn all through the 12 days of Christmas. And if you can manage to keep it going until Epiphany on the 6th of January, you will have a really lucky year ahead. So if you were, say, Bob Cratchit and his family, and you had a fireplace about that big, you would hope that your little log would just burn for as long as possible. And it is a lovely tradition. In fact, we have, this is an old house where we live, and we have a big inglenook fireplace. And we did choose a Yule log one year. It was just a great big piece of wood. That's our Yule log. And said, it's got to burn from Christmas Eve, certainly through to the end of Christmas Day. But it lasted about 4 hours, I would say. So we had very bad luck. But it is a very nice idea, this thing of just dragging home this piece of wood. And again, as you were saying, it's such an old tradition, and it connects you with nature and this whole feeling that you have got to have lights burning in the house, you've got to have heat. And there's obviously a practical part of this as well, because imagine you've got the Lord of Misrule cavorting around all over the place, everybody's having an absolutely whale of a time, and nobody really wants to have to keep stopping to stoke up the fire every 10 minutes or something. So it's a lovely idea that you've just got this blazing hearth with this huge piece of wood. It's lovely.
So I thought not having a big fireplace was the thing that was going to stop me from burning a Yule log, but I also have a lazy eye as well, so I wouldn't be able to go near the thing for my squint. I thought not having a big fireplace that's the least of my problems, apparently. Well, there you go. If I'm going to stick to festive tradition, there's no Yule log for me.
Oh, I think I would ignore that bit of the tradition.
Okay, so we've got the midwinter festivals, which, as we said, have probably been going on for millennia, and then there was Saturnalia, followed by the Christian Church a few hundred years later taking advantage of these midwinter festivals in order to make Christianity more appealing, which I have to say was a smart move, and obviously worked quite well. When was Christmas first called Christmas in Britain?
It came in round about the 12th century, I would say, and it's called Christmas, obviously, self-evidently, because it is Christ's Mass. And And at first it was just a general festival, so it was just the name for the festival. But it's interesting that then gradually Christmas began to separate, and there was the festival, and there was also this personification of Christmas called Father Christmas. So yes, and actually in Puritan times, during the Protestant Reformation, from the 1500s, mid 1500s, Christmas was pretty much a taboo word because it was a mass. So it was Roman Catholicism, which was absolutely banned, and in much of Western Europe. And so certainly in Britain, Christmas was, you couldn't really mention it. In fact, it was struck off the calendar. It was banned. And
how long was, oh, sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, how long was Christmas cancelled for?
In Scotland, it was 100 years. From 1560, well, 101 years, 1560 to 1661. And God, it must have been ghastly. And in Britain, in England, it was 1647 when Christmas was officially, you weren't allowed to practice it. And it was reinstated in 1660 when Charles II came to the throne and repealed all the laws that had been passed during the interregnum.
And you wrote in your book that there were actually soldiers patrolling the streets to make sure no one was celebrating Christmas. Wow.
Yeah, it is astonishing, isn't it? It is absolutely astonishing. And you read some of the diaries of that time. I put in the book a little extract from John Evelyn's diary of the time, talking about going to celebrate Christmas because he wasn't going to be stopped, and how the militia were about, and various people that he'd celebrated with were hauled off. And it is an extraordinary thought that it should happen in this country. The loss of freedoms, it's quite amazing. And in fact, that did really damage Christmas. Because as we know in Scotland, Hogmanay, New Year's Day, or New Year's Eve, is much more celebrated than Christmas even now. So in Scotland, Christmas really took a knock and never quite recovered. It did recover here, but it took an awfully long time for it to get back into the swing of things.
So do you think generally that Christmas is celebrated with sort of less enthusiasm in Scotland than it is in the rest of Britain?
In my experience, yes. One of my family is married to a Scotsman and lives in Scotland, and she says, yes, Christmas is it's celebrated, but it's nothing compared with the way it is in England.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Well, in her experience, I mean, it might be different for other people, but
sure.
Certainly.
Because Scotland sort of has festive vibes when I think of Scotland, but maybe that is Hogmanay more than Christmas, as you say. Yeah. Now we get to talk about my favourite part of your book, if that's okay. The origins of Father Christmas. So we've got Wotan, Odin, and Woden. Can you tell me about the to literally quote your book, the distinct and intriguing similarities between Father Christmas and this trio of ancient gods?
Well, yes. So there are these three old gods, and Wotan was one of the gods of the ancient Teutonic tribes, and he had something which was called the wild hunt in the sky, which was a terrifying sounding race through the sky. And it only happened when there was a disaster of some kind coming, which makes you think about comets, actually, because comets are supposed to presage disaster. And in Old Norse mythology, it was Odin who was the counterpart of Wotan. And he flourished in Scandinavia long before Scandinavia became converted to Christianity. And he had a long beard and he had a long cloak. And he was the principal god of the Norse pantheon. and he was associated with war as well as magic. Now, where it gets really interesting, really, really interesting, is that his companion was an 8-legged reindeer called Sleipnir. And they used to fly across the sky, and with the help of Sleipnir, Odin would leave presents in the shoes of children. Well, what does that make you think of? And which is one of these wonderful ways, I think, in which, I mean, who knows actually how Wotan and Odin became, and Sleipnir morphed into Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer and St. Nicholas and all the rest of it, except, as we've been saying, Christianity obviously took all these old beliefs and thought, oh yeah, we'll use that and we'll just give it a little Christian twist to make it acceptable to us.
Yeah, I've heard it said, and I know that this is sort of incorrect now, but I've heard it said that that Father Christmas was sort of invented in the 18th, 19th century. And from reading your book, obviously, it does seem like there's some truth to that. It seems like the myth of Father Christmas accelerated quite rapidly during that period of time. But once again, it was based on something that went much further back by the sounds of things.
Oh yes, Father Christmas was first mentioned in a masque, which was an entertainment, and that was in the 16th, 17th century. And he was just mentioned, and then he cropped up again as Sir Christomas and things like that. And at that point, he was a very thin figure with a beard, wearing a hooded coat, which was either green or brown. So he sounds a bit like Odin. And he used to have, in one of these plays, he had an argument with Shrovetide, which is Easter. And Easter told him that he was out of the almanac, he was old-fashioned, just go away. And so we got him personified at that point. Then we had the Puritans arriving, and Christmas, forget Christmas, it's banned, you're not allowed to celebrate it. And then, yes, he began to creep back again, Father Christmas, this figure. And what I think, for me, the person who reinvented Father Christmas is Charles Dickens. Because in 1843, which is an incredibly significant year in the history of Christmas, Charles Dickens, as we know, he wrote A Christmas Carol. And The Ghost of Christmas Present, which is also interesting, I think, because then you think of, Christmas presents. So The Ghost of Christmas Present was this jolly man. If you look at the original Cruikshank illustration, there he is. He's skinny still, but he has got this cloak, hooded cloak, fur trimmed. In the coloured illustrations, it's green, and he is surrounded by food. And he looks like a good chap to have a laugh with. And that was really the beginning of, for me, that was the beginning of Father Christmas as we know him now. He did put on weight, as so many of us do as we get older. And yeah, the idea, I know what you're alluding to, Coca-Cola, I imagine, the idea that actually Father Christmas got his red coat trimmed with white fur because Coca-Cola used him kind of as an advert, but actually he was already dressed like that long before. And then there is he popped up again in a poem, 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, and he was then dressed, he was fatter then, he was a jolly red-faced elf, according to the poem. And he's called St. Nicholas as well, which is a throwback to the 6th of December in Holland and much of Western Europe, where St. Nicholas was believed to be a saint who would bring presents to children and put them in their shoes on the 6th of December. So we're going back to Odin and Sleipnir again.
So it was like there was Odin and did you say Sleipnir?
Sleipnir, I think it is. Eipnir.
Okay. So there was Odin and Sleipnir, which sort of morphed slightly into St. Nicholas, which then morphed into Santa Claus and Father Christmas, who, it blew my mind when I was reading your book. Santa Claus and Father Christmas aren't the same person. They're amalgamation of two different historical, mythological characters. So similarly, Father Christmas took a similar trajectory to the midwinter festivals in general, which is that it's kind of chopped and changed and morphed and amalgamated over the centuries into how we know it today. So it's fascinating, really.
It is absolutely fascinating. And so actually, for me, I get quite annoyed when I hear somebody talk about Santa Claus when they mean Father Christmas, because I think this is not just some kind of British versus American thing. These are different people.
Right. Yeah. So for me, it has always just been a British versus American thing. I've never called him Santa or Santa Claus, and I just find it a little bit, Americanized. It's always been Father Christmas to me, but now I've got even more reason to continue that tradition of refusing to use the term Santa Claus, because they are quite literally different people. So Santa Claus, that was a Scandinavian tradition as well. Was it Sinterklaas?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, Sinterklaas.
And that comes from Saint Nicholas. So he in Scandinavia and in Holland, in the Netherlands, Sinterklaas. And then the Dutch settlers went to America. They moved to what they then called Amsterdam, which became New York. And they talked about Sinterklaas. And you can see how that could turn into Santa Claus. Mm. And also then because against, again, this idea, it's a saint, Saint Nicholas. We can't have saints. They are popish. So during the Protestant Reformation of the 1500s and 1600s, when it was absolutely at fever pitch, poor old Saint Nick, forget him. And he became, in Germany, something called the Christ Child, Christkind, became the little figure that would come and bring presents on the 6th of December. So he'd become the Christ Child. German settlers went to America, and Christkind morphed gradually into another American name for Father Christmas, Santa Claus in their case, which is Kris Kringle. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It is absolutely fascinating.
It really is. And I'll tell you what I quite like about the whole thing. The Christian church in the 3rd century capitalized on the old midwinter festivals and then created Christmas in order to make Christianity sound more appealing. And yet 13, 14, 1500 years later, Jesus Christ and Father Christmas start competing for the role of Christmas protagonist. And actually, Father Christmas they would have considered it a heathen tradition if you were to speak to them about the Sleipnir, and then Sinterklaas, Saint Nicholas. It's interesting that Father Christmas came along a millennium and a half later and kind of became the Christmas main man. It's kind of took Christmas back for the pagans. That's funny because Father Christmas really did Father Christmas started having such a ridiculously influential impact on sort of children's lives. There's so much magic and nostalgia entwined with the idea of Father Christmas. The excitement of him bringing your presents. I think every child remembers when they realize he's not real. And
what?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. No, I remember what it was for me. I think I had sort of wised up to it slightly by this point, but I was like 8, I think, and I got a metal detector for Christmas, and it was from Father Christmas. But I said to my stepdad, look, I got a metal detector from Father. Oh no, I didn't. I said, look, I got a metal detector, and he goes, oh no, I know, I helped your mum buy it. I helped your mum choose it. So he didn't know that it was meant to be from Father Christmas, and I don't think I remember being heartbroken that Father Christmas wasn't real, because I think I was suspicious already. I think I remember actually just being irritated that he'd said it. Like, oh, come on, you had one job. It shouldn't have been that difficult, you know, like that was just, could you not have just kept it going for a little bit longer? Do you have any recollection of when you first, like, was there ever a moment when you were like, oh.
Well, it's now. I don't understand what you're talking about.
I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. And this moment is going out on the internet for the world to see. I apologize. I am so sorry. I could be wrong, of course.
Children, if you're listening, he's wrong.
Yeah. Exactly.
Wrong.
Exactly.
Only because he hasn't been good enough and Father Christmas hasn't visited him recently. That's all it is.
That is absolutely right. I mean, it's quite funny though, isn't it? Do you think part of the reason that adults still love Christmas so much is that it, like, it's kind of like you're like indoctrinated from childhood almost. Like, it's kind of like you're like festively brainwashed in a way.
Yeah, I think, but you see, not everybody is, because I've got friends who hate Christmas, absolutely hate it. I said to one of them a couple of years ago, "What are you doing at Christmas? You know, what plans have you got?" And she said, "I'm just waiting for it to be over." I thought, what? So I know not everybody loves it, but yes, I think we are kind of brainwashed, and especially now, looking at, say, television channels which just screen Christmas movies all the time, most of which I think should be binned, frankly. I've watched a couple of them by accident. But yeah, it's the thing is, we haven't used this word yet, but it is such an amount of commercialization that the message is easily lost, isn't it?
I completely agree.
What we've been talking about, what we think is the true message of Christmas, which is really about something magical, something bigger than us, and about being with people that we love. I think that's the most important thing.
I agree. And I think, I can't speak for your friend, of course, but I think probably the reason a lot of people don't enjoy Christmas is because the commercialization aspect of it, the focus on presents, although presents has always been part of Christmas, as you say, but I would say the commercialization aspect of it puts people under a hell of a lot of pressure. So if you're going through a hard time personally, or probably in a lot of people's cases financially, providing children or your family with the Christmas that they see on television, for example, or the Christmas that their friends are having, or it's a lot of pressure for people. So I imagine that's one reason that people just want Christmas to be over. I mean, it's an expensive time of year for me, and I don't have a wife and kids. You know, I mean, I just think about the people I do need to get presents for, and you know, and then you want to you go out a few times, you have food, etc. It does add up. And then, but then of course you have children and you have a family. It's suddenly Christmas. It turns into a huge financial outlay for a lot of people, which, as you say, means the kind of essential message does get lost a little bit, I guess.
I think so. And as you say, it can be enormous pressure. I mean, even without all those things, if you're cooking Christmas lunch, there's an enormous pressure somehow to make this meal better than any other meal in the whole year. And inevitably, it's the day when the roast potatoes won't crisp up and you realise you forgot to buy any carrots. And yeah, it's which actually I think is when the fun can start. For me, one of my most cherished memories about Christmas is one Christmas when I had come from a big family that when I was in my, up until about my 40s, I suppose, there could easily be 14 of us at Christmas lunch.
Wow.
And my mother and her two sisters would take it in turns to do the cooking. We'd go to each of their houses. And one year, everybody came to us, to my mother's, and it was bedlam in the kitchen. And we got to the mince pies. My mother had even sprinkled sugar on the mince pie, homemade mince pies, put them in a lovely dish, put them on the table. She'd made about 15 vats of custard. And my great uncle, who was a chef, took the first bite of mince pie and custard and said, "This is made of salt." And my mother had, in her panic, had mistaken the jar of sugar in the kitchen for the jar of salt. And so the custard tasted as though it was made from the English Channel. And so she had to make more, and my grandfather had to wash the mince pies to get the salt off the top of them. But it's it was a disaster, but actually it was great fun. We all had a really good laugh about it, except for my great uncle, who somehow was appalled. And so I think it's things like that where you think, oh, it's just another day. It actually, there's always next year, you hope. And does it really matter? But yes, I think there's this awful pressure. Everybody's got to be well. Nobody must have any sniffles. This is, even in normal times. If somebody's feeling a bit under the weather, then they're considered to be a bit of a party pooper. Yeah, there is so much which can make Christmas a bit of an ordeal. And I think particularly if you are bereaved or you've just broken up with your partner the night before and everybody is all cheery and jolly and you want to just go and sit somewhere quiet. Yeah. So it can be a mixed blessing.
Yeah, because I think, you just touched on that. If you're bereaved, the financial side of it is one thing, but seeing as Christmas is all about family, if you don't have family or some of your family have passed away, it can be a very sad time for people. I think it's important to remember that as well.
I agree. I totally agree. I mean, for me, most of the people I used to celebrate Christmas with have long gone, but we still raise a glass to them. And I still imagine that they're all around. And I always wish them a happy Christmas as well.
Your story about the salty custard was quite hilarious. It reminded me of a story which isn't quite as funny, to be fair, but I'll share it with you quickly anyway. It's just a little thing that always stuck out in my head about when my mum was pregnant with my little sister, who's 10 years younger than me. She went to hospital on Christmas Day. She wasn't given birth. She just wasn't very well. And she went to hospital on Christmas Day. So my stepdad had to take care of the Christmas meal. And my nan was there, and she was very old at this point. And she was sat there, she was sat there whinging about the potatoes. I mean, I remember I was just thinking, come on, my mum's just gone to hospital. She got carried out on a bloody stretcher a minute ago, and you're moaning about the roast potatoes. Come on. It was always stuck out in my head. So the Christmas stocking is another one of these random little traditions. Filling a giant sock with presents. What's the story behind that?
It comes back to our friend St. Nicholas, who was this chap who Saint believed to have helped children. And the idea is that he was a real person and he had magical powers, because there are various stories about him. There was one where he interceded when there was a butcher, I think it was, who was fallen on really hard times. And he put 3 little boys in a barrel and was going to sell them their meat as ham. And St. Nicholas found out about it, interceded, and released the children. We don't know what he did to the butcher, but let's hope it was something horrible. And then there's another story which is directly linked with hanging up Christmas stockings, that St. Nicholas heard about a father who had 3 daughters, who they all had men that they loved, but he was going to put them out as prostitutes because times were really hard and he needed the money. So he was going to be their pimp, basically. St. Nicholas heard about it and he dropped some coins down the chimney, and the girls had they'd washed their stockings and they'd hung them up by the fire, and the coins fell down into the stockings. So that is why we put chocolate coins in Christmas stockings.
Wow. There you go. There you go. What about mistletoe? Why do we kiss underneath the mistletoe? Do we know about that?
That is a fertility symbol. And it's there's an anatomical reason, really, why if you think about mistletoe berries and how that they might be a fertility symbol.
Okay.
And people used to put mistletoe above the bed of newlyweds so that they could be fertile. And the idea was that with mistletoe at Christmas, you'd hang up a sprig of mistletoe, kiss one another under the mistletoe, and you had to remove a berry every time you kissed somebody. So presumably you needed masses and masses of mistletoe so you could replace what had gone. It's a nice tradition, I think.
I've never thought about the anatomical side of it. I'm never going to be able to look at mistletoe the same way again. Okay, what about turkey? Did we always eat turkey at Christmas?
No, it's thought that the first person to eat turkey at Christmas was Henry VIII.
Of course, Henry VIII. He was probably the first person to eat a wide variety of different foods, I imagine.
I would imagine so, yes. And he was probably the first person to eat a box of chocolates as well. And yeah, he had turkey, which was brought over specially, and you can imagine how much money it cost. And those were in the days when they were massive feasts. I think you would have been sitting at the groaning festive board for hours and hours and hours. And turkey figured on the menu, but mostly people ate goose or swan, again, was another dish that if you were rich, you could have. Turkey came in really in the Victorian times when there was a bigger market in them, and turkeys had been established over here by then. They came from the Levant, which is why they're called turkey. And in Victorian times particularly, turkeys would be bred in Norfolk, and then they would be walked to London to be sold at markets. And the poor little things, they would be fed up. They would have been fed absolutely up to the eyeballs and fattened as much as possible. And then they were given little leather shoes to protect their feet. And then they were walked from Norfolk to London, which must have taken a long time. And they would be skinny little things by the time they got to London, of course. So they'd have to be fattened up again, ready for slaughter. And Charles Dickens, again, in A Christmas Carol, talks about turkey because the Cratchit family have got this miserable little goose, which they eat every morsel of it, every atom of it is gone because it's so small. And on Christmas morning, Scrooge wakes up and sends a boy out to buy the biggest turkey of all for the Cratchit family. So by then, turkey was, it was a perfectly acceptable thing to eat, and most people did eat it. So that's why we eat turkey. It was a good old Henry VIII.
That's really interesting because you often hear people say that turkey's not actually that nice, don't you? So the Christmas meal is supposed to be the nicest, biggest meal of the year, and people don't really like turkey. Some people like it. I mean, everyone sort of thinks it's all right, don't they? I mean, I don't have a problem with eating turkey, but it's not the tastiest meat in the world, is it?
No, it's not. But I think it depends how it's cooked.
Yeah, maybe I just don't know how to cook a turkey.
Well, the great uncle of mine who was the first one to eat the salty custard used to say you had to cut the legs off because it's the legs that take longer to cook than the breast. So cook the legs separately, and then if the breast is cooked, you can take that out and also roast it upside down, apparently.
Okay.
So that all the juices fall into the breast meat.
I'll have to keep that in mind for for a couple of weeks' time. What about the origins of the Christmas cracker? Do we know about that?
Yes, Christmas cracker, such an essential part of Christmas, and we just pull them, don't we? And we don't think why we pull them and what they're all about. This is actually interesting because my grandfather, who really came into his own every Christmas, he made Christmas so special for us. He used to refer to crackers as bonbons, and I never understood why. And then I did research on the history of crackers, and I realised why my grandfather called them bonbons, because there was a man called Tom Smith who developed Christmas crackers. He went to Paris. This was in Victorian times. He went to Paris and he was intrigued by, they had little sugared almonds, which they wrapped up in pieces of paper, and they were called bonbons. Good, I suppose that's what it meant. This was in 1847 when he first discovered these. This was the same decade that A Christmas Carol was published, and also the same decade when Christmas cards were first developed. So it was a really big decade in the history of Christmas. So he thought, he brought home these sugared almonds. He made his own sugared almonds. They sold like hotcakes, but he realized it was a very temporary market. It was very seasonal. So he worked out how could he extend it. And eventually he developed what we now call crackers, big pieces of card covered in paper with a cracker. The cracker is the snappy bit, and with mottos and hats and so on. So that's how we had the Christmas cracker. And the company, Tom Smith, is still going.
Oh, wow. Imagine someone had told this industrious chap, Tom Smith, that 170 years later, people would still be using Christmas crackers. Because, I mean, the vast majority of human beings aren't remembered 170 years later. And then a few of them leave a legacy as a human being. And I think the Christmas cracker legacy is a noble one.
I agree. And also, of course, now you can have birthday crackers and Easter crackers, can't you?
I didn't know that.
Actually, it seems to me all wrong, frankly. But yeah, I suppose it's, how can we make the most of this? But yeah, I love Christmas crackers.
So Christmas trees. It's hard to imagine Christmas without a Christmas tree. A home without a Christmas tree is not a festive one. Think if you were living on your own, people might say, have you got a tree? Or you don't have a family. People might say, have you got a tree up? And you might go, oh, no, not this year. It's a bit pointless, really. And it's like, yeah, fair enough. But it's a bit depressing, really, not having a Christmas tree at Christmas. Where did the Christmas tree tradition come from? When did it become a regular part of Christmas to have? Because it's quite bizarre, really, to have a tree with lights on just in the house, and millions of people do it every year, and no one has a clue why.
Well, you see, I think we're going back again to what we talked about earlier about this stepping away from the religious connotations of Christmas and going back to the midwinter festival when everything is dark and we're celebrating the rebirth of nature. There's a story that I think it was St. Francis of Assisi was walking through a forest. He saw a pine tree and all the stars were behind it because it was a starry night. And there's something about that image that became just gradually moved into the idea of decorating trees. So I think he put candles on a tree in a forest. And then, so you can understand, okay, so we've got that. And then other people started doing it. People started decorating trees in situ. But the idea of the actual Christmas tree, we're often told it comes from Queen Victoria, but it actually doesn't. It comes from Queen Charlotte, who was the Queen Consort of George III. And she came from Germany, where they did have this tradition of decorating pieces of tree. And it was often a yew bough. But in 1800, she was having a party for all the children, I suppose, at the palace and on the estate and so on. And she potted up a complete yew tree. And she decorated it with candles and sweets and little toys. And you can imagine the scene, can't you? The children wouldn't have been let in until it was dark. So you can imagine them being let into a room. She opens the doors, all the children go in, and there is a tree covered in lights, in little candles. How fabulous. And so that is thought to be the first example of a Christmas tree in Britain. And then Queen Victoria, in the 1840s again, in 1841, wrote in her diary that she'd got two little children and they gazed at the Christmas tree with wonder. They had their first Christmas tree, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, in 1840. And in 1847, the Illustrated London News had an illustration of the royal family gazing at a Christmas tree. And after that, of course, everybody who was anybody had to have a Christmas tree. So
that's really interesting. So do you think that the Christmas tree evolved from that moment, not just in Britain, but was that where its journey across Europe and other parts of the world began, do you think?
Well, I think it was already in Europe because of the German tradition of decorating boughs, but certainly it went straight across to the States.
Wow. Okay. So on the topic of the royals, it was never something really that interested me when I was growing up, but in the last, I'd say 5 years or so, I absolutely love the Queen's speech. When was the first royal Christmas message and who delivered it? And perhaps you can share who it was written by as well.
It was in 1932 and it was delivered by George V, who was then king. It was 2.5 minutes. And who wrote it?
It was one of my. Sorry, go on.
Rudyard Kipling.
It was Rudyard. That was one of my favourite facts from your book. I never knew that the first Christmas speech was written by Rudyard Kipling.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that's amazing is how the Christmas speech over the last nearly 100 years now, I suppose, or 88 years, it's amazing how it's gone from radio to television to obviously now we live in the age of the internet as well.
Yes. Yeah.
So yeah, the method of broadcast has changed quite significantly, and yet the speech itself continues.
Yes. Yes.
I like that.
I feel sorry for the royal family. And apparently until 1960, it was always done. It went out live. Can you imagine how ghastly it must have been, especially for poor old George VI, of course, who, speech impediment and absolutely dreaded it. If you've seen the film The King's Speech, about how he went to see Lionel Logue to discover, to be able to speak with greater fluency and less hesitancy, particularly because of the Christmas broadcasts. It's a fabulous film. So yeah, I can imagine the poor man sitting there toying with his Christmas lunch, thinking, in an hour, I've got this awful ordeal. So from 1960, it was pre-recorded, so the royal family can enjoy themselves and don't have to think, one must go out now and prepare one's face.
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to enjoy the day, would you? The whole day would be focused around that, and you'd probably have some sort of anxiety or nerves the night before and that morning, and it would completely overtake everything else, wouldn't it?
It would be awful. Absolutely awful.
We spoke about turkey briefly. If we could just have a quick whirlwind tour of two other Christmas foods, which sound actually quite horrible. What they used to eat. There was the Christmas puddings and the mince pies that they used to have, and the ingredients of Christmas pudding and mince pies used to be quite different than they are today, didn't they?
Oh yeah, lots of meat. Yeah, disgusting thought, isn't it? And mince pies, yeah, originally made with chopped meat and fruit and raw.
Yeah. I mean, you shared the culinary tradition of the mince pie with a 1394 recipe of. It really doesn't sound very nice. Pheasant, hare, rabbit, pigeon, and then all of their offal. It just doesn't sound good, does it?
No, it doesn't. Although I suppose at the time it was probably.
Yeah.
You were grateful to have it, I should imagine.
I imagine so. At the time, it was probably, for a lot of people, that was probably quite, well, actually, I imagine for a lot of people, that was an extremely nutritious selection of food to be eating, to have pheasant, hare, rabbit, pigeon, and offal. In fact, that almost sounds like it would have been a rich man's treat.
Oh, I should think so.
Yeah.
I should think so. Because, Advent was a fast for a long time. It was a fast.
Yeah.
So fine if you had fish and lots of vegetables to eat while you were observing the fast before the first great feast day on Christmas Day, but must have literally been a very lean time if you were a normal person with limited resources.
Yeah. It would make sense for that fast to continue, wouldn't it? Considering everyone gets so fat over Christmas, it would be not. It actually makes complete sense to go on a sort of diet. I mean, if not a fast, but a diet until maybe a few days before Christmas I'm sort of doing that now in a way. I'm having a couple of weeks of a health kick at the moment because I know around the 21st of December things are just going to completely go south. So, but it makes sense to do that, doesn't it?
It does. It makes complete sense. And then Christmas Day is really special because you're able to eat all the things you haven't been able to eat for the previous 3 weeks. Originally, it was a 40-day fast. It was as serious a fast as the Lenten fast. Mm. Yeah, it makes sense. And in fact, there was a fast, traditionally, there is a fast day over Christmas on the 28th of December, Holy Innocents' Day, which is a commemoration of when Herod had every child under 2 in Bethlehem murdered, in case it was a little baby Jesus. So that's a very solemn day in the Christmas calendar. So that was traditionally another fast in honor of all those slaughtered children. Mm. But also you can imagine, it would have been quite a relief, actually, after all that, I've got to let out my belt another notch. Oh God, there isn't another notch.
Yeah, I mean, reading your book, honestly, I was reading it on Saturday, and it honestly made me hungry. I started texting my friends, literally trying to. I created a what's well. First of all, what I did, which you may find funny to know, is because we had our festive feast a couple of weeks ago. I created a WhatsApp group and I added my friends to it who were at this meal with me, and I just started sharing the recipes from your book with them about the mince pies and the Christmas puddings and the feast at Buckingham Manor or Buckingham Hall in Thornbury, where they catered for 580, 90 guests, and there was like just dozens of animals involved. And I started messaging my friends just little screenshots from your book saying, I think we need to have another festive feast. I don't think I'm done. I think I need another one. And then honestly, I had my dinner and I wasn't hungry anymore. And I thought, oh no, I was just hungry. That's literally what happened on Saturday night. Yeah. It's great. It's great, and that's something else that I was thinking. Like I mentioned earlier, it'd be nice to have these Christmas traditions when I have kids in the future. It would just be funny to try and cook some of those some of the old things they used to eat, the old drinks and the old food, to just cook them up and see if you can make it taste nice now, or to just as experiment.
Yeah. Why not?
Why not? Okay, so then I think it would be nice to end on this story. I think a lot of people will know this story, but perhaps we can just chat about it quickly, and you can tell me your account of it. I think something that's an incredible testament to the power of Christmas is the Christmas truce in World War One. I think many people have, like I say, have heard of that, but perhaps you could kind of cover it quickly, just for those who haven't.
Yeah. First World War, Christmas Eve, 1914. And the English soldiers started to see, it was quiet, they started to see lights in the German trenches. And they heard the German soldiers wishing each other a happy Christmas. And the soldiers just got out of their trenches. The Germans got out of their trenches. The English got out of their trenches. They met in the middle. They shook hands. They wished each other happy Christmas. If they had a bit of chocolate that they wanted to share or a cigarette, they did that. It was just human being meeting human being with absolutely no thought about which side of that ridiculous war they were on. And they agreed, many of them agreed that they would have a truce overnight, or some of them had a truce for a couple of days. It gave them a chance to bring their dead back from no man's land and bury them. So it was complete suspension of hostilities. And there was a football match as well, which I think has been turned into a film, between the Germans and the English. The Germans, I think this is right, won 3-2. And so it was just wonderful. And then they agreed as well, the soldiers agreed that they would give one another fair warning when hostilities would start again, which they did. So it is a wonderful idea that they just called a complete truce and just met as man to man. And then you think, well, if you could do that, why on earth weren't they able to just continue it and say, let's just sort this out? But hey.
I know, it's heartbreaking to think how many of those men then went on to kill each other.
Oh, I know. It is a bizarre story. It's a wonderful story, but it is completely bizarre.
Yeah,
thinking
I know.
What happened.
And you know, it really does. I can't think of any story which symbolizes to a more extreme extent what almost the power of Christmas for people. For even in those circumstances, they were able to hold a truce for that holiday. And then, as you say, when that holiday was over, to continue just go committing unimaginable crimes on one another. Yeah, it's difficult to fathom, really, isn't it?
It is completely difficult to fathom it. You know, W.C. Fields, I think it was, said, rather than have a war, the two leaders should have a fight. They should each fill a sock with custard and whack each other around the head with it. and whoever won, that was it.
That's funny.
Yeah, I often think of that.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting. It makes you think as well of, for a very long time, obviously, we did have warrior kings who would actually personally go and fight in their own wars, which you have to think at least has a slight bit more integrity than just allowing others to go and do it.
Oh, absolutely. Like Henry V leading his men into battle at Agincourt and Richard III. Exactly. Rather than sit at home barking orders down a phone.
Have you read Bird Song by Sebastian Faulks?
No, I haven't.
That's an extremely emotional book about World War One. And that's what I think of every time someone mentions World War One now. It's so vivid, so beautiful, and so emotional. I got the impression when I put that book down that I was never going to read a book quite like it ever again.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can't remember if the Christmas truce is in that, but one thing I'd just like to ask you quickly before we go, it's a bit of a personal question, really. It's not so much linked to Christmas. It's just something that I'm interested in. When you are writing a book, well, first of all, how long did it take you to write the Book of Christmas? Did you say 4 or 5 months?
Yes, it did. It was off the top of my head, yeah, probably 6 months, doing other things as well, but yeah. Pretty much intensive. That was the main thing I was doing.
When you're writing a book, how many hours a day can you write for without your brain getting a bit frazzled and convoluted? Do you do like 6, 7, 8, 9 hours? Or because I Stephen King, I think writes for 4 hours a day, which seems like quite a short working day.
I would say it depends. For me, it depends entirely. I can't work for too long because then my brain does get frazzled, and what seems to be coming out really well when I read it the next day, I think this is absolute rubbish. So say 5 hours maybe of really hard, solid work, maybe 6. But after that, I think there is a problem with quality control. And yeah, you're talking about Stephen King's book on writing. It's a brilliant book.
It was actually, in fact, I've been recommended to read that by someone, so I will have to do that. But I was actually referring to a clip that I saw on YouTube of Stephen King and George R.R. Martin having a conversation.
Oh, right.
Yeah. And George R.R. Martin was saying, how do you write so many damn books? Because George R.R. Martin, I think, sometimes goes 6 months without putting pen to paper because he waits until he feels inspired. And whereas Stephen King, I think, is much more disciplined.
Oh, yeah. And I agree with Stephen King, actually, having read that book several times now. He says, don't wait for the muse to call you. You've got to turn up and do it, and the muse will come to you, because if you're not there, you're not going to do anything. So, yes.
Well, I'm repeating now. This is very similar to a conversation I already had on this channel a few videos ago, because I was speaking to a historian called Annie Whitehead, and I was asking her the same question. And the conversation that I had with her is kind of almost went in the exact same trajectory as the one we're having now. It's just something I'm interested in. So I am now going to repeat the same quote that I said in that last conversation, which is, as Picasso said, inspiration strikes, but it has to find you working.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've got one for you then. Mark Twain. Writing is all about application. The application of the seat of the pants to the seat of the chair.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Because you know what? I mean, I like writing. I really do. And I've written to sort of some extent in the past, but certainly not extensively. And for me, it's like, I just find it so hard to sit down and get going. And I just don't know why. I don't know what that procrastination is. I don't know where it comes from. It's almost like something deep within. It's like I feel when I write, I feel relief. It's almost like it feels like I'm a lighter person for writing. It's like it comes out of me, and it's like like I'm not carrying something anymore. And yet, actually starting it and doing it just seems like the biggest chore in the world.
But that is absolutely classic of all writers, I think. Roald Dahl used to sharpen every pencil before he started work every morning, which was procrastination. And we all do it. Oh, I will, I'll think, right, I must start. Oh God, I must do some writing. Right, well, I'll start it after I've tidied my desk, after I've done that. Once I was up against a really awful writing deadline. And I found myself washing the kitchen floor. And I thought, You really are procrastinating, because it's not my usual kind of thing at all. Anything rather than get on with what you know you've got to do. But yes, also you do reach that point where you think you're going to burst if you don't start writing. And I think that is often the point where get it out now. Don't do anything else, just go and write it now. And even if it doesn't come out the right way, just get it out onto the page or onto the keyboard, onto the screen. You can always come back to it, but you have to really be, I think you have to be disciplined about it, because people have often said to me, how are you able to write all these books? Well, I just start writing them. You have to, otherwise you can't call it, well, you can call yourself a writer, but you have to just get on with it. I think it's an absolute classic, anything rather than get on with the job at hand, because it is a grind. We watch films where there's a writer, it's just the pages are mounting up. I remember seeing a film once about Lillian Hellman, and a film called Pentimento, I think. She used to live with Dashiell Hammett, and she was typing, and she was so frustrated, she just picked up her typewriter and threw it out of the window. And I thought, yeah, I know that feeling. But you just have to just bash away. It's a cold face.
I think probably part of the reason that so many, not just writers, but artists procrastinate is because their work is so deeply personal. And so unlike other work, it really feels like you have to find something from within, something quite intimate and special almost, in order to get going. And that probably informs where the procrastination comes in, because it's hard to tap into something so deeply personal, maybe on a regular basis.
Oh yes, I think so. Yeah. Yes.
All right. Well, I'm glad that you're a writer, because you wrote this book, which I really enjoyed.
Thank you.
And I've enjoyed this conversation as well.
Me too.
Thank you for writing the book. And thank you for joining me today. It's been a pleasure. Can you do you have anything that you would like to share in regards to social media links or websites for anyone listening?
I have a website at Jane Struthers at sorry, I'm getting confused with my email address. janestruthers.com.
janestruthers.com.
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. And maybe we'll have to do a whole separate interview on writing one day.
I would love that. I would absolutely love it, because I'm an editor as well. So that is my life, really.
Right. Okay. Well, maybe I've been meaning to read that Stephen King book on writing for a while. So maybe I should read that a couple of times, and then maybe I should try and do some writing of my own, and then maybe we should film another interview on that topic.
That would be great.
Yeah. That
would be absolutely brilliant. Oh yeah. There is so much to say about writing.
Well, let's save it for next time. Jane Struthers, you've been an incredible guest, and thank you for joining me today. And I hope you have a very Merry Christmas.
Thank you. I hope you do as well. Thank you.
All the best.
Bye.